Hello and welcome to ORF Digital Conversations. As COVID-19 progresses, possible shifts in global and regional power equations and the shape and format of a post-COVID world order are the subjects of much consideration. Will the pandemic contribute to triggering further shifts in the Indo-Pacific? To discuss this, in conversation with me today is Jeff M. Smith, Research Fellow, Asian Studies Center, the Heritage Foundation, Washington, D.C., and an author on Asian security matters. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
Great. Jeff, let me start by asking you about the Quad countries, US, Japan, India, and Australia, who are now working with South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand in what is being referred to as the Quad Plus dialogue. In March, they began a teleconference, which is now going to be a weekly thing where they assess the situation of COVID-19 and they sort of try to coordinate their efforts in mitigating the crisis. Do you see this as a positive or promising move for the grouping and its role in the Indo-Pacific?
I do. I really do. And we at the Heritage Foundation and myself personally have been very big supporters of the Quad for many years. Since 2014, after the first Quad was dissolved, we've been running an annual Quad Plus dialogue, bringing together think tanks and some government officials for a Track 1.5 dialogue, along with a Plus partner, specifically to encourage the group to reform, but also to add other members and promote functional cooperation with external members. So this is actually something that we have been urging the Quad to do for many years. Let me just say about the Quad Plus that we do have to be careful because the Quad countries themselves are not calling this a Quad initiative. I think the Indian media labeled it that, and I understand why, since it did involve all the Quad members. But I think we should be clear that this wasn't an agreement made at one of the Quad's regular meetings. And so it is not formally a part of the quadrilateral dialogue, but it is nevertheless noteworthy that the Quad countries are involved in this. And in fact, I have a paper coming out, should be in a few weeks on the Quad, that talks about its origins, that talks about the path forward. And it argued that humanitarian aid and disaster relief was really what spawned the Quad in the first place. That it was the response to the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 that led to the formation of a regional Quad group among the Quad members that eventually led to the first quadrilateral strategic dialogue in 2007. And so humanitarian aid, which, disaster relief, you could certainly consider the pandemic to be within that portfolio. I think that's an area ripe for more Quad cooperation because it's an area that has very little political resistance and helps play to the strengths of the Quad in terms of their soft power, in terms of their ability to provide and promote aid to countries throughout the region. So we think this is really a wonderful initiative for the Quad. We think it's a great way to get experience forming functional technical cooperation with outsiders without expanding the membership of the Quad necessarily. We don't have to add new members every time we want to do something, launch a new initiative, but we should be able to work with like-minded partners in these various multilateral formats, including this new Quad Plus phone call. So we hope to see this continue on a weekly basis, and we hope to see it used as a template for future cooperation with external partners. And we're, in general, excited about the revival of the Quad. We think this is a very important initiative, and we're very encouraged to see India now, I think, more wholeheartedly embrace the concept, particularly since Minister Jaishankar came in. He's on several occasions spoken highly of the Quad since he was brought back into government. And so the one thing we have yet to see, I would note, is the Quad survive a major change in government. We've seen great progress upgrading it to the ministerial level, adding a counterterrorism exercise. All four governments seem invested. But we also have sort of conservative, forward-leaning governments in all four of the countries. It's been that way now for a few years. So I think it will be another test to see the Quad survive changes of governments in each of these four capitals. I don't expect anything to change. You know, the election in the US, I think if there's a change in government in India, Japan, Australia, I think the dissolution of the first Quad kind of still stings 10 years later. So I think it still has bipartisan support in all four countries, but it is noteworthy that we have yet to see how this initiative moves with a change in government.
Right. You know, it's also being speculated now that the post-COVID world order will see a more hawkish China in a more intense race against the United States, and that Southeast Asia will become the playground for this resurgent competition. How do you see this?
Well, I think, you know, Southeast Asia has been a playground for competition now for, you know, well over a decade. You know, since China had become more assertive in its maritime boundaries in 2008, 2009, and sort of progressively since then, I think Southeast Asia has been one of the key battlegrounds. And that goes back really to 2010 when China began referring to the Southeast Asia, the 9-dash line, as a core interest. When it began becoming more aggressive with its maritime militia, of course, the artificial island building, the seizing of Scarborough Shoal, and then a broader competition for access and influence and leverage in each of these Southeast Asian capitals. It's really been one of the key battleground states or battleground regions, I would argue, for a decade now. You know, the Southeast Asians have mostly tried to sort of have their cake and eat it too, which is to maintain a good security relationship with the U.S. while welcoming Chinese economic investments and closer political alignment with China. You know, so far the results of that sort of balancing game, I would argue, have been mixed. They have been able to sustain this political and security relationship with the U.S. while deepening engagement with China. But you do have to wonder at what point does that proximity to China, that welcoming of these large-scale infrastructure projects and investments, at what point does that begin to raise security questions in these countries? Does that begin to erode their sovereignty in a way that's acceptable to the public, to the militaries, to the political establishments? We have seen some pushback in some countries like Vietnam, like the Philippines, where President Duterte has really had a major outreach to China, but whose sentiments are not necessarily shared by the Filipino public and the military and security establishment. I do think Southeast Asia will continue to be a major battleground region. They are a huge source of Chinese outbound investments. China's influence there has been growing. Many Southeast Asian leaders are very open about their desire to become even closer to China. But whether they're going to be able to continue this balancing game of reaping the benefits of security cooperation with the U.S. while having sort of unmitigated economic benefit from closer ties with China, I think that does remain an open question. And I do expect that competition and that balancing act to continue to play out and probably even intensify after the COVID pandemic has sort of passed. One of the open questions, too, is to what degree Southeast Asia will be able to take advantage of any foreign firms leaving China and moving to sort of safer locales and locations, moving their supply chains out of China. There's some evidence that Southeast Asia will be able to attract some of those investments and reap some of those benefits, but it's still a very sort of unsettled market at this point.
Right. In early April, the US military applied for an increase in its funding through the US Indo-Pacific Command for increased presence in terms of their naval, airborne, and ground-based operations through a spending plan titled Regain the Advantage. Can you expand a little on how the US seeks to bolster its ties with countries in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I did a little write-up on this Regain the Advantage initiative, which is an interesting new proposal, as you said, from the Pentagon. It amounts to about a $1.6 billion increase in funding for 2021, and proposes about $18.5 billion in additional funding from 2022 to 2026. And what is that for? What is that designed to do? One would be adding new U.S. destroyers to the Pacific, expanding the Army's multi-domain task force, which includes specialization in precision-guided rockets, artilleries, mortars, missiles. I believe they're looking into adding new ballistic missile defense installations in Guam, as well as other infrastructure improvements in Guam and Hawaii, in Alaska. They're looking at modernizing the fleet of Aegis destroyers. And there's also a maritime security initiative that was launched by the Obama administration in his second term, I believe 2015, 2016 timeframe, which was designed to provide a new pot of money that would help distribute aid to countries in Southeast Asia. The Trump administration expanded that initiative early on to also include, Congress also has a role in this. In fact, they were the ones who expanded it to include Indian Ocean, South Asian and Indian Ocean countries in the Maritime Security Initiative. So countries like India, Bangladesh, the Maldives are now able to attract money from this new sort of pot of funds designed to bolster the maritime security capabilities of specific U.S. partners. So one thing that this Regain the Initiative program is asking to do is to expand that pot of money further to include Oceania, island states, Pacific island states in the South Pacific, which I think many in the U.S. now see as a new sort of emerging geopolitical front for competition, for access, influence with China. I think, you know, U.S. Pacific watchers, some of our friends in Australia, have been quite alarmed at the expansion of Chinese influence and activities in Oceania, in the South Pacific Islands. And so, as part of this Regain the Advantage, I think the Pentagon would like to see, would like to have the ability to access some of these maritime security initiative funds to strengthen cooperation with our Oceania partners. So let's see, according to the Pentagon, Regain the Advantage is designed to persuade potential adversaries that any preemptive military action will be extremely costly and likely fail by projecting credible combat power at the time of crisis, and provides the Secretary of Defense with flexible deterrent options. So it's new pots of money for joint force lethality, force design and posture, strengthening alliances and partnerships, new exercises, experimentation and innovation, and enabling logistics and security cooperation. So quite a broad set of new activities, the DoD, sort of a new wish list for the Pentagon to strengthen our work and activity in the Indo-Pacific.
Right. Let me come back to the issue of the South China Sea, which you mentioned. There has been a general sense for quite some time now that India should assume a more prominent role with relation to this issue. And do you think that India can continue to remain neutral?
Yeah, so India has been, I would say, assuming a more productive role in the South China Sea. You know, since Chinese activities there have gotten more aggressive, many have been calling on India to play a bigger role in the South China Sea. To date, that has sort of manifest mostly in expressions of support for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. India has been a fairly stalwart on that. India was very supportive of the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal, which essentially ruled that China's 9-dash line has no basis in law and is essentially invalid. And India has had the occasional run-in with Chinese Navy in the South China Sea when the Chinese Navy has said, you're entering Chinese territorial waters. Indian Navy ships have mostly sort of ignored these warnings and continued to proceed on to their destination. India has also engaged in a joint sail with the U.S. Navy, the Philippines Navy, the Japanese Navy just a few months ago. And so I think India has been relatively active on the South China Sea question when you compare it to other countries in the region. India is not doing freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, but frankly, neither is Japan, neither is the Philippines, neither is Thailand, neither is New Zealand. India has done about what I think America would have expected a country like India to be doing there, and wants to continue to see calls for freedom of navigation, peaceful dispute settlement, respect for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But I think, India has been fairly clear in its strategic doctrines and its speeches that the Indian Ocean is its sort of primary area of interest, and a place like the South China Sea falls into a secondary area of interest. It's not part of its immediate domain. It's not able to operate there the way it can in the Indian Ocean. I think there's a recognition that this is sort of home field advantage for China, but that all of us, US, India, Japan, Southeast Asian countries, have an interest in not seeing it become a Chinese lake, not see it become a region completely dominated by China where Beijing can dictate who can and can't access international waters there. And so India's tried to walk a bit of a tightrope. It also has had for many years, ONGC, and a private Indian firm, has had an oil block in Vietnam's EEZ in an area that overlaps with China's 9-dash line claim. And there was a point at which China tried to apply substantial pressure on India to withdraw that block, and it refused to do so for many years. The last I saw, ONGC was considering vacating that block, may have even done so by now. But my understanding is that was largely because there was not resources found in that area. Not necessarily from political pressure, but I'd be interested actually to get an update from some of my Indian friends on where that stands these days. Long story short, I think India is seen as playing a constructive role in the South China Sea, but not necessarily a critical role in the South China Sea. For now, that falls more to the United States, to Japan, and hopefully to the countries who are invested there, who have territorial disputes with China. Sometimes we need them to step up more. We can't be more concerned about the state of affairs, about the infringements on their sovereignty than they are. And they send mixed messages at times. Well, we don't want you to come in and be provocative toward China and do any aggressive maneuvers, but we also don't want you to abandon us and become too docile. So it's always this case of we want you to do more, but we want you to do less, and we want you to play the game exactly how we want you to play it. And sometimes that leads to a sort of mismatch in expectations and outcome.
Right. I think we're running out of time. So one last quick question. Going forward in the post-COVID world order, do you see an expansion in India's role in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's part of a secular trend that began before COVID. And I think India's interests, influence, power projection capabilities have been growing steadily, for some time now, and are going to continue to grow. And India's interests in assuming greater responsibilities and in operating farther from its shores and in taking an interest in security affairs farther from its borders is growing naturally along with its GDP, with its growing military capabilities. And I think from America's perspective, that's a good thing. You know, we view India as a net provider of security and stability in the Indian Ocean. And when we look out across the region, we see a large number of challenges. And in almost every case, India is not contributing to that challenge. It's contributing to the solution, or it's helping us to manage those challenges cooperatively. And that includes in the Indian Ocean region, countries like the Maldives and Sri Lanka in recent years, when we've seen periods of instability. We've seen the US and India quietly working together behind the scenes, I would say more effectively than we have in the past. And so that's a good thing from our perspective. So the answer is yes, I do expect India's leadership role in the region to continue to grow after the COVID pandemic, and maybe even more quickly, as this pandemic has helped draw contrast between India and China, between our democratic partners who are more open and transparent and countries like China that are not.
Right. It was great to have you with us today, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time.